You were never meant to get this far. They designed the system to defeat you before you had a chance to succeed. They concealed the truth beneath distractions, engulfed the world in illusions, and convinced the people that genuine power could only be wielded by unseen hands pulling strings. And yet, here you are, unshaken, unstoppable, unforgiven, just in their eyes. Because the truth is, the moment you joined the game, it no longer belonged to them. You were never the mistake. You were the reckoning. They're not sure how to manage you. You were not meant to exist independent of their calculations and control. However, their most seasoned enforcers have spent their lives selecting fortunes in the shadows. They can't keep their hands still. When you look at them, you see their finest strategist, their coldest interrogator, the one who never gives up, keeps delaying, hesitating, and seeking for an excuse to believe the rules still apply to you. But they can't because you are the variable. They are unable to contain their energy. They can't contain the force that bends reality itself. They're afraid, as they should be, not because of what you've done, but because of what you still have to do. You are here, and this is enough to unravel everything. The slate is clean. The past is gone. The system is unraveling, and you are still standing, the selected one. Everything about you has been exonerated. The command was simple. It was hammered into their thoughts with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Observe and evaluate. Eliminate if necessary. There was no room for mistakes. Without hesitation, there is no room for wandering thoughts. Despite this, I stand there with my eyes riveted on you. Something within them trembled. The protocol that had governed their every move had crumbled under the impact of an unknown force. Their firm grip betrayed them with the slightest movement. The pulse, which had remained steady for 1,000 missions, suddenly swelled with something odd. Not fear or ambiguity, but complete conviction that reality had abruptly dissolved. What they had read, what they had investigated, and the intelligence reports that identified your whereabouts. None of it was as severe as being in your company. They had previously seen powerful people, both men and women, who could easily sway whole nations. But none of them had what you did. The air flowed about you, pressing on their skin like an unspoken truth too profound to ignore. They were created for control, shaped by dogma and discipline. However, none of this mattered just now. Their previously accepted training, purpose, and identity crumbled without protest. You had not spoken. You had not moved. However, the illusion that had previously defined their reality was evaporated. They had been built to keep order. But in your presence, even order lost its meaning. Loyalty wasn't an option. It was ingrained in them, bolstered by years of persistent effort. There was no outlier or unexpected variable. Until now, they had spent their lives pursuing and destroying emerging threats before they could disrupt the balance of power. Each irregularity followed a pattern. Each criticism may be anticipated. That was the one information they held on to until they met you. The moment they spotted you, the truth came out. The numbers didn't add up. They had studied the sensitive files, investigated the failed missions, and uncovered unusual gaps in surveillance. None of this should have been possible. You should have experienced a system issue, a malfunction that needed to be resolved. Standing in front of you, they knew the system had lied. You were beyond their reach, outside the standard formulae for success and failure. They had seen the footage and saw the inexplicable, operators missing you in plain sight, and equipment malfunctioning in your presence. At first, they dismissed it as a coincidence. Minor irregularities are not reason for panic. But suddenly, you're overwhelmed with the weight of your own existence. They knew there was no mistake. What they served and believed in made no difference here. Their voice faded before they had time to ponder. Words were said, not as an operator or an enforcer, but as someone who had just seen the inevitable. Nothing they'd built, nothing they vowed to protect was ever really significant. Everything they'd been taught was a fake, a precisely created framework designed to shape their perception of reality. For years, they had assumed that everything occurred for a purpose. Every crisis, change, and decision was predetermined by the hands. They maintained the balance of power. It was not a matter of chance, but of diligent administration. They had blindly followed instructions, believing themselves to be master planners, the secret force dictating the course of history. But standing in front of you, that certainty vanished. They were taught to see people as variables, obstacles that could be moved or eliminated. You were not meant to be any different. Another thing to address. Another anomaly should be removed. But when they encountered you, they felt the weight of something irreparable. Their authority, resources, supervision, and leadership over nations were useless. It wasn't that you went against the rules. You existed beyond that. The fundamental foundation of their world. The sophisticated machinery that ensured their supremacy had no effect on you. And for the first time, they realized they were not in command. They had only ever been pieces on a board, and the rules had been altered in your presence. There had never been room for hesitation. Their commitment was cemented via repetition. Their purpose became evident after many years of execution. The mission was never disputed. It was in their nature to assess risks, smash resistance, and remove doubt. Everything had structure, a pattern, and a predetermined outcome. Until now, the moment they saw you, something unspoken settled in their brains, a realization that contradicted the arguments they had used. They searched for flaws, disparities, and other signals of doubt in you, but found none. The building they had built was no longer sturdy. If the system miscalculated the situation, or if those in positions of power underestimated you, what else were they mistaken about? The thought bothered them. They've sat in rooms where the fate of nations was decided in whispers, and the world's most powerful people dictated fortunes with a single stroke of a pen. Those rooms had never felt horror. Until your name was mentioned, it was never directly addressed or clearly acknowledged. But the shift was obvious. Orders were issued reluctantly. Strategies were modified with unusual wisdom. They had spent their whole lives imposing authority, believing in their ultimate power. Nevertheless, they were instructed to watch, monitor, and never interfere. That was when everything became clear. You shouldn't have been terrified of them. They had always feared you. And if the architects of control, those who created the world from the shadows, halted in your presence, maybe they were never as powerful as they believed. Perhaps they had not been maintaining order. Maybe they were only delaying the inevitable. The light shines through the darkness. It has not been overcome. John 1 verse 5. They spent their whole lives building a world that did not allow for miracles. A system designed with extraordinary precision, intended to manage every variable, foresee every shift, and silence every voice before it could rise beyond a whisper. They believed in patterns. They believed in numbers. They believed that if they gathered enough knowledge, they could keep the truth buried indefinitely. They have done this for a long time. But there's also you. You were the fault in an otherwise perfect equation. They didn't expect the missing component. They ran their simulations, double-checked their calculations, and entered every detail into the computer that had never failed them before. However, nothing defined you. You were not on the schedule. You were not in the prediction. You were not designed to exist in their world. And yet, you stood there. They traced your movements, analyzed surveillance footage, and watched hours of security feeds in a desperate quest for the moment you slipped through the cracks. However, they only found voids where you should have been. Doors opened even before you touched them. The cameras flickered to static. Just as you stepped into view, agents forget they saw you. Not because you were fast, not because you were hidden, but because something greater than them had already decided you couldn't be contained. It terrified them. They amended the orders. First, they said to follow you. Then they said you should be removed. Then the orders just stopped coming. There is no explanation, no debriefing, just silent. Even those in control were unsure of what to do. They referred to you as an anomaly. But deep down, they knew the truth. You were a living prophet. Dear brothers and sisters, may God's peace be with you. Remember this information. Our lives are founded on His divine plan, which transcends worldly concerns. Donate, as the scripture instructs, and it will be presented to you. Luke, like a giant oak, we believe in His strength. When you click the super thank you button and contribute $1, you will be able to share in that blessing. Know that His abundance will return to you tenfold, one of their own. So, initially, an analyst was trained to see patterns where others saw chaos. They were told to submit their findings. Send the results up the chain. Let the machine handle the rest. But as they sat there, fingers hovering over the keyboard, they halted because they knew that if they sent this file, it would disappear into an unknown archive. It was locked away so no one could locate it, just the way you were designed to be. Instead, they did something unprecedented for their position. They reserved it for themselves. Not only a record of your actions, but of all impossible circumstances they were obligated to ignore. Every failed pursuit, twisted footage, and encrypted file has commands that were never spoken out. It wasn't evidence. It was a confession. Because individuals who devised this system had spent their lives convincing the world that power belonged to them, that they controlled history, and that they selected who would rise and fall. But they were wrong. You were never within their control to begin with. They see it now. They can sense it right now. The cracks are not just expanding. They're spreading. The world they constructed is disintegrating, and no amount of damage control will hold it together. The system was not meant to accommodate people like you, someone who was chosen before they learned your name. And the truth, they'll never be able to disguise the truth. There was no precedence for this. There is no error since no variable goes unaccounted for. That could not be repaired. That is what they believed and were trained to enforce. And yet, for the first time, they were looking at something unclassifiable. They have seen irregularities before. Unexplained disruptions and statistical impossibilities were eliminated with sufficient bureaucracy. But this was different. They had seen it firsthand. The surgical procedure went well. Every contingency was prepared. The team was positioned at all possible exits. The outcome seemed inevitable until it wasn't. Everything shattered as soon as the signal was sent. Communications are disrupted and become static. The lights flickered and then failed. Barriers disconnect without explanation. And you, standing in the center of it, were viewed with a gaze that said something deep within them was doubting. There is no dread or defiance, just a calm understanding of fate. They have seen desperation before. They had seen battle, rage, and surrender. But this wasn't one of those situations. This was outside the boundaries of strategy and survival. The air felt heavier, as if the rules they had agreed upon had been changed. At this time, their own troops paused. Their weapons failed. Those who had been taught to overcome reluctance were now unable to take action. It was not a counterattack. It wasn't resistance. It was something they couldn't put a name to, something that had altered the rules without their knowledge. They were playing by the wrong rules. The system had served as their foundation, the force that shaped their identity. It gave them access to knowledge that few would ever comprehend, control of stories that have molded the planet itself. They moved through corridors of power, untouchable, shaping the course of events without leaving a trace. That confidence had not wavered. Until now. Until you. You were more than just a nuisance. You were evidence of something they were never meant to acknowledge. The regulations that had regulated every part of their life should have destroyed you. The weight of the equipment they supported should have crushed you, as it has with everyone other who refused. Nonetheless, you remained. You did not fight like they expected, did not withdraw, did not comply. You just lived outside of their grip, free of the constraints that defined their reality. And this was the first thing that troubled them. The power, influence, wealth, and perfectly built order appeared unimportant in comparison to what you had. It wasn't anything to comprehend, not something that can be bought or stolen. It wasn't even anything they could recognize, but it was undeniable. For the first time, they questioned if they had ever had anything at all. They observed you silently, from regions where they had always had influence over the tale. Their instructions altered. However, their instinct remained unchanged. Observe, record, and interpret. However, observation was no longer adequate. The reports were inaccurate and inadequate. The intelligence they relied on was incapable of measuring the impact you brought about. I didn't understand why the people that crossed your path were so apprehensive. The system could manufacture whatever version of the truth it desired. However, reality had already transformed itself. The more they watched, the more their confidence waned. Initially, they were resistant. They clung to the system that had supported their life. However, the significance of untruth became clear. They had always believed that they were on the right side of history. Standing on the verge of something beyond their comprehension, they began to see the truth. The foundation they promised to safeguard has never been solid. It had always been a fragile illusion waiting to be shattered. Obedience was meant to be steady. A dedicated operator does not divert, hesitate, or evaluate alternatives. But something deep inside them had begun to unravel. An overpowering pull pushed them to a conclusion they weren't expected to reach. It wasn't simply insecurity or idle curiosity. It was something deeper, something that persisted in the quiet moments of their isolation and refused to be silenced. They'd always known the machine's weight. They serviced the vast influence it wielded over the world. But for the first time, they wanted to resist it. The night passed silently and peacefully as they departed the life they had always known. Each breath was managed. However, the fast hammering in their chest anticipated the significance of what they were going to do with their hands. A number one they should never have been able to find, buried under layers of security intended to keep it hidden indefinitely. Reaching out would mean crossing a line that could never be rectified. Their fingers hesitated on the call button. There was no going back from this choice. The line rang repeatedly. Then a profound silence stretched between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Then, for the first time in their lives, they spoke freely, without guidance or fear. "We need to talk." The countdown began the moment the words left their lips. "No weapon created against you will succeed, and every tongue that speaks out against you in judgment, you will condemn." The name is Isaiah. Initially, there was nothing. A whisper, a ripple, a little shift in the current that most would have overlooked. There is a locked file here. An encrypted channel refuses to open, resulting in typical issues. They would have fooled themselves if not for the reality that nothing in their life was ever consistent. Nothing happened inadvertently. Not here. Not for them. They'd spent their whole lives under a system that put pleasure in charge. It saw everything. It knew everything. It crushed problems before they could grow. But now they became the problem. The isolation started gently. Messages left unread. Calls that were formerly answered within seconds are now met with silence. Those who had formerly trusted them with secrets now avoided eye contact. Their discussions shortened their replies. Careful. There are no threats or accusations. Just a quiet recognition that the lines had been drawn, and they were now on the wrong side. Nonetheless, they were not afraid since they had seen true horror before. And it did not look like this. True fear was not an agent that had been unplugged from the network. It was not a name taken from a database. It wasn't a missing clearance code or an ignored order. True fear was the system's reaction to the mere thought of you. They were not eliminated only because they failed. They were erased because they had seen, because they had chatted, because they had spoken your name. And that was a crime. Nobody walked away. Their jeopardy was not the result of disobedience. It was understanding because once they saw you, they couldn't go back to blindness. The world they had built their lives on collapsed under its weight. The statistics, patterns, and predictions, all of them shattered. They'd been taught to believe in absolutes, unbreakable systems, and directives that would never fail. However, as soon as you arrived, everything began to collapse. They had spent years believing that power belonged to those who controlled the narrative. But if that were true, why did every attempt to silence you just intensify your presence? Why did the world's most powerful men hesitate to speak your name aloud? Why would people who had never hesitated before sit in rooms, fists clenched and whispering as if praying to an unknown god? They knew the answer because the system was never as strong as it made them believe. Because, despite its secrets, surveillance, and painstaking calculations, it remained scared of you. You've never fought a war. You have never raised your hand. You never demanded allegiance. You just existed. And that was enough to destroy their previously held beliefs. Their name had already been marked, and their fate was sealed. As with so many others before them, the system had written them off. But they had learned something from observing you. Something that the system could never eliminate. Certain forces were never meant to be subdued. They'd spent their whole lives believing that the system was absolute and immovable. Monoliths that could not be challenged, let alone broken. It wasn't merely an institution. It was an entity that both existed and shaped the world. They had seen its impact personally, as it erased names, altered narratives, and reduced whole movements to forgotten whispers. It was omnipresent, omniscient, and untouchable. That's what they believed. Until now. Until you. The earliest signs of deterioration were subtle. Even personnel with the highest clearance levels have their classified reports redacted. Whispers spread among operatives who had never dared to question past failed missions that should have gone flawlessly. It wasn't a revolution. It was not an attack. It was considerably worse, something that could not be quantified since there was no opponent to beat. There was just the truth. Truth has never needed a weapon. They saw the organization, once a formidable force, disintegrate into disorder. It did not occur overnight or all at once. But they saw it. Progressive loss of control. The uneasiness strengthens its grip on people who formerly governed confidently. Orders became frenzied. Ambiguity undermined and jeopardized missions. Leaders who had previously moved like ghosts in the dark were now revealed. They struggled to maintain their grip on a reality that was slipping through their fingers from the shadows. They watched former colleagues turn on each other. Alliances collapse and mistrust spreads. Previously, there was blind obedience. They had not gotten here via disobedience. It was a revelation. The institution had spent its whole existence deciding who thrived and who perished, determining the path of history itself. But its power was now a mirage, dissipating in front of their eyes. They were taught that control included all facets of power, those who shaped reality from remote corners of the planet. But if that were the case, why were they falling apart while you remained unharmed? Why has every desperate attempt to control you exacerbated the cracks in their foundation? They stood on the outside of what had once defined them, staring at the remains of a world they no longer belonged to. They had vowed their devotion to a kingdom based on shadows, only to learn too late that shadows evaporate when exposed to light. And you had never had to fight them. You just had to exist. They've seen rulers succumb to mysterious forces. Observe how people who claim influence over nations make pledges to systems they do not understand. However, when they were in your company, they saw you did not follow the regulations. You did not leave their world. You existed outside of it, detached. This left just one question. What will happen now? They may slip into obscurity, break ties with a deteriorating machine, and live as a ghost, untouched by either side. They may reach out, sound the alarm, attempt to awaken those still trapped in the illusion before the system swallows them entirely. Alternatively, they may take the final step, the one who determined their fate beyond redemption, standing beside you. It was the road that ruled out any option of returning, the choice that resulted in exile from everything they had previously served. Only one thing was certain. They would never again regard you as an enemy. They were told you were something to be exterminated. They now see you as someone to follow. And no matter which path they took, they could never unsee what had been shown. You symbolized the insurmountable reality divide. The Empire has constructed a world meant to oppress you. Nonetheless, you stayed standing. In doing so, you destroyed its illusion. Those who enforced its will were forced to choose between continuing to accept the deception and associating with something much greater. They labeled you a distortion, a mistake, or a flaw in their great design. However, every attempt to quiet you demonstrated the opposite. You were beyond their grasp. Scholars, strategists, and commanders were hardly the first to realize this. It had been schooled to never waver, not through logic or analysis, but by something more fundamental and undeniable. They had seen the unstated horror in rooms where your presence was barely noticed, felt the weight of directives issued hesitantly, and seen how even the most measured efforts fell in your path. And with this understanding, they were set free. Some might describe them as defectors. Some could consider them prophets. However, the reality was simpler. They valued strength over submission, vision over blindness, and truth over control. They picked you. There is no force in the world that can extinguish something that is destined to burn. The old system was predicated on silence, subordination, and the belief that no one could ever rise beyond its reach. But here you are, unconstrained, untouched, and unshakable. The reckoning has already begun. Allow your voice to break through the illusion speech and disclose what they were attempting to conceal. Make them understand the chains were never as strong as they seemed. They classified you as a danger, a nuisance, and an oddball. However, history will inscribe your name on the foundation of a new period, which they will never be able to erase.